Welcome. Today, I'm going to be presenting Research Methods, Part 1, Quantitative Research. This is Dr. Catherine Fisher. Please be sure to check out my Part 2 video for qualitative research. Today, we're going to look at what is a research design and a hypothesis, what are quantitative methods and quantitative analysis, and I'm going to provide a brief example of my own study using some of my own research. So, what is a research design? And when you think about social workers, we tend to want to study social problems or study what are effective interventions or what are some of the types of factors that interact with each other to increase risk or increase success in client outcomes or community outcomes. So when I'm thinking about studying a social problem, I might want to consider different research designs. Am I wanting to do an experimental design, comparing two groups? Maybe one client group is going to get a new intervention, and I'm going to compare it to the control group that received standard care. Or is it a descriptive study? I'm just looking at what are the averages, kind of what are the frequencies of how people experience these symptoms. Or I'm doing a cross-sectional. I'm doing a cross-sectional sample of a larger client population or cross-sectional study on a community correlational studies, case studies, or longitudinal designs where you're looking at maybe an annual survey, maybe it's a national survey, and every year it's taken, you can compare across years to look at long-term trends, social trends. All research can be categorized into quantitative and qualitative approaches. What do I mean by quantitative? Quantitative research collects numerical data. It's testing for cause and effect statistical relationships between variables or a correlational relationship or a predictive relationship. For example, an experimental design is quantitative research. Qualitative research looks at non-numerical data. It's looking at collecting interviews, field observations, looking at images, stories, symbols, and it analyzes content for key themes. Examples might include an ethnography, a detailed case study looking at how problems in a community develop, for example, or looking at people's experiences with a particular phenomenon. Quantitative research can be defined using quantitative methods that are deductive in nature. They are guided by predefined variables, guided by a hypothesis, right? A statement about what you think you're going to find is a significant change or effect. And it typically uses mathematical and statistical tests to reach conclusions. It involves a systematic examination of the numerical data using structured instruments like a standardized test, some type of mood scale, surveys, using yes or no answers to determine frequencies or averages, or a scientific experiment comparing two groups. The data that can be produced is measured and compared. And the analysis to determine, what are some key significant findings uses statistical techniques, tests to determine what are the frequencies, what are the relationships. Quantitative data usually uses a sample that is representative of the larger population being studied. If it's a large sample size that's pretty diverse and pretty reflective of the characteristics of the larger population, then we can confidently generalize our sample findings to apply to the larger population. And we want to make sure that we are using accuracy, reliable structured instruments that have been proven to uh, be consistently producing the same results. They're repeatable, and the results are not biased, that we use an objective, non-biased approach to have valid results. What is a hypothesis? Quantitative studies test a hypothesis, an empirical statement that's derived from the researcher's own experiences, observations, knowledge of the field, knowledge of the problem, to develop some kind of a hunch about what the relationship is between these different factors. An example would be a null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis to be tested. The null hypothesis states that there's no difference, for example, in pre and post test scores between the experimental group and the control group, while the alternative hypothesis states that the experimental group shows a significant non-random change in their pre and post test scores, showing that the experimental intervention had a significant effect, thus rejecting the null hypothesis. Quantitative research methods uses variables. These established variables fall into two categories. Independent variables are the factors that the researcher intentionally applies or alters in the experiment, while the dependent variables are the outcomes that you measure, changes in a client or a community's behavior, knowledge, test scores, outcomes, for example. Here's an example of a hypothesis from my own research. I was interested in piloting an assessment tool to look at MSW students' skills attainment. The researchers hypothesized that MSW students who complete field internship training will show a significantly higher post-test scores on the piloted vignette-based skills assessment measuring social work competencies. Now, in my study, I said I'm going to use a t-test, and if the pre-post test scores are significantly higher, that tells me that students' field internship really did help them learn social work core competencies. I set my p-value, the significance level, at p equals 0.05. A 0.05 is the commonly acceptable threshold that indicates statistical significance, meaning that I rejected the null hypothesis and I found support for my alternative hypothesis. I suggested that the observed effect based on my t-test scores isn't due to chance, that it directly corresponds to a 95% confidence level, that this was a non-random significant change in the student test scores. Sometimes researchers will use an even smaller margin, maybe a 98% confidence level, right? Maybe a p equals less than 0.01. Now, when we collect data, typically you're going to get larger amounts of students that have the average test score, and then the outliers will score extremely high or extremely low. If you have a pretty representative sample, you tend to see a bell curve, right? More scores in the middle and then less scores on the extremes. If the data all showed extreme test scores, that might be a sign that my data is biased or skewed, right? Did I just test the A plus students, or do I really have a diverse sample of students? So here's the research questions. I have another study where I looked at housing, building affordable housing, faith-based and religious groups that built affordable housing. And I wanted to look at what were some of the challenges or barriers they encountered. But let's look at my research study number 2. How effective is field internship at helping students attain sufficient social work competencies, as measured by a piloted vignette-based skills assessment? And this was administered by faculty And this was in part because we were noticing that field instructors often tended to overinflate, and rate students very high after internship. And we wanted to have a more accurate way to measure whether they learned core CSWE core competencies. So when we do quantitative research, once we collect the data, we need to clean the data and build a spreadsheet and then provide variable names so that we can, it helps us prepare for our statistical tests, our statistical analysis. So here's an example of some data points, variables that I used when looking at faith-based affordable housing development, um, how many years it took to build, what were the number of units produced. And numerical data can be categorized by different types of data: ordinal, interval, nominal, or categorical. And we can use different statistical tests depending on the type of numerical data. Sometimes quantitative studies use a Likert scale. A Likert scale can have an ordinal ability to test the ordinal data because you're looking at levels of frequency, right? Or strength, right? Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. That has a numerical range. So quantitative statistical analysis typically uses these types of tests: frequency tests, correlation tests, logistic regression. That's where you're using multiple variables and modeling them to see how many are having a stronger or a smaller predictive relationship and predicting that outcome, that independent variable and dependent variable relationship. T-tests are very simple, pre-post test scores. I used a t-test in looking at my study, ANOVAs or chi-squared for more categorical variables. So in the right-hand side in my slide has my results. I used paired t-tests to compare MSW students' pre-post test scores. After completing field internship post-training, the average score on a scale of rating scale of 1 to 4, their average score was 2.48. And the difference between their average pre-score was 1.79. The difference was considered significant. My t-test score was found to be at a p was less than 0.05%, that the change was non-random and it was a significant amount of change in their post-test scores, thus rejecting the null hypothesis and proving the alternative hypothesis that students significantly gained social work skills after completing internship. Now, all quantitative analysis will use a descriptive statistic that helps the audience or the academic audience know that your sample is pretty diverse. For example, here I have descriptive statistics on my MSW student sample, right? We see it was mostly female. I have types of races, was it a racially diverse sample, and the ages and the enrollment types. So you always want to look at the descriptive statistics first when you're analyzing a research study, and standard deviations. If standard deviations are quite large, that might show that the data is somewhat skewed. All right. So in my quantitative studies, number one, I looked at what were some of the affordable housing development project planning barriers. I had 31 participants complete an online survey, and here you see, did local residents express opposition to the congregation-sponsored affordable housing development? I found that a significant percentage, 22 and 16% said moderate to severe resident opposition. Local residents did not want that low-income housing project, and they created a lot of barriers to try to get it not approved, right? Versus city government. Did the city government express opposition to the congregation-sponsored affordable housing development project? And the results showed that none or very mild were much larger, right? Above 90% said there was very little opposition from city government. So this showed that there was the most barriers were coming from the local neighborhood residents that were opposed to low-income housing being built in their neighborhood. In my qualitative video, part 2, check out how I use qualitative data to really dig deeper into what was underlying neighborhood opposition. But on the right-hand side, you see the results from my study looking at MSW students' pre- and post-test scores after completing field internship. And here you see that in pre-training, their average score on the vignette-based skills assessment was 1.79. However, after completing their field training, their average score rose to 2.48 out of a maximum test score value of 4. 4 would be above average competent. And my T-scores showed significance below P equals 0.05, which showed that I proved the alternative hypothesis that there was a significant change, a significant effect that field internship had on students' skills. And I was able to reject the null hypothesis. So here in my results, this is how you would write it up in an article, right? My T-score, my p-value, and the strength was R equals 0.64. So this was a pretty strong effect. You're going to learn more about this in your statistics classes, but I hope this shows you that quantitative research methods can really, when done well, can really help us understand effective interventions, understand the relationship between different factors. Conclusion, we can test our hypothesis and learn from research questions using quantitative research design, quantitative research methods to determine if there is an effective intervention, if a difference does exist between variables to predict risk factors or successful factors, and help us develop our own social work knowledge base, evidence-based research that informs effective practice. Thank you, and be sure to watch my part 2 video on qualitative and mixed methods.